What's up, guys? Welcome back. Always excited to have all my peeps out there checking out the videos, all those brand fanatics and aspiring brand fanatics. Got an interesting session for you guys today. Today is Vcast number 4, and we're going to be talking about measuring and tracking brands. So, if you've checked out my other videos, we talked a lot about why brand matters, brand pyramids, brand Bibles, all the great tools that you use to put in place to start building your brand. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is brand tracking, right? So obviously the big question comes, once you started making those investments in brand, you're hiring your first brand teams, maybe you're head of brand, you're a brand marketing director, you're starting to hire and put together teams, you're starting to invest in maybe making a new logo or doing brand advertising or doing sponsorship campaigns. The natural question that's going to come up is, okay, great, how is this moving the needle? How is this actually impacting our business, right? How do we actually measure the performance of our brand campaigns and how our brand is doing over time? So today's session is all about talking about that, right? So we're going to talk about the brand tracker and explain a little bit what that is, why it matters, what kind of metrics you should be tracking. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk about a couple of providers that actually do this kind of stuff. So, that when you guys want to go out and measure brand performance and do brand tracking, you know who to talk to. And then eventually in the future, what I'll also do is I'll put up, a post and a sample of a brand questionnaire so that you guys actually can get an idea of what kind of questions you should be using when you're actually doing brand tracking. So first off, what is a brand tracker? A brand tracker basically is a set of questions, usually somewhere around 25 questions in length. It's kind of a qualitative questionnaire where you go out and you ask a bunch of questions about your brand to consumers, right? Why does it matter? Well, first of all, it matters because essentially the perception of your brand, the strength of your brand changes over time. It's not constant. I mean, there are some brands, for example, especially the very big brands like Coke or Pepsi or Apple or Google, they don't have a lot of change in brand strength over time. Sometimes that change happens much more slowly. But particularly when you're talking about early stage companies and startups, you may be coming from a point where you've never done any advertising. And so your brand awareness is this, right? It's really low. And then all of a sudden you raise your Series A, you raise your Series B, you're starting to invest in marketing, you're starting to invest in advertising, then you'll see that, your brand awareness may go up significantly, right? So you want to be tracking that. So measuring and monitoring your brand health over time is one of the main reasons why people do brand trackers, right? The second thing is really to track the impact and the effect of your marketing campaigns, right? So again, this is going to depend a lot industry by industry. In some industries like, fast-moving consumer goods or consumer internet, you see a lot of advertising, and that advertising tends to be kind of consistent over time. In other industries, you see less advertising, right? But regardless of the frequency, what you want to be doing is you want to be tracking the effect of your marketing campaigns. And by doing brand trackers, you should see changes in brand awareness or brand recognition or brand strength over time as you increase or decrease the amount of marketing that you're doing, or as you change the kind of campaigns that you're doing or the kind of creative that you're doing, right? So measuring kind of effectiveness is important. Fourth, one of the other things that you want to be tracking, and another reason why brand trackers matter, is you want to be looking at, your positioning, right? You want to be looking at, okay, if a consumer is aware of my brand, that's great. But, what do they remember? Like, what are they actually saying when I ask them, do you know XYZ brand? What are they saying about that brand? How do they feel? What do they think our positioning is, right? And how is that positioning changing over time? Because if, consumers are out there and they're aware of you, but they think that you're one thing and you're actually trying to position yourself a different way, then you have to course correct, right? Fifth, it's always good to keep tabs on what your competitors are doing. So, one of the things I've commonly seen brand trackers do is also measure and assess the brand strength of competition. Particularly if you're in a very competitive industry, you want to be keeping tabs of, who out there has a strong brand, how are they perceived, and how are they perceived compared to your brand, right? To what extent potentially might a consumer of yours switch to actually going out and trying another product, trying another brand, right? And lastly, the last reason why it matters is, one of the most important things in marketing, particularly today, in this day and age of social media and mobile and everything else, is word of mouth, right? And in some industries, word of mouth can be 50, 60, 70% of the awareness that you get can be driven by people who are basically going out and they're telling their friends how wonderful your product is, or potentially how bad it is, right? It really depends. So, consumers' willingness to endorse you is really, really critical to most businesses, right? We call that NPS, which stands for Net Promoter Score, right? So, their ability to endorse you and how they feel about your brand and how they talk about you when they talk about you to other people, that's really important, right? So those are the 6 things, monitoring brand health, tracking the effect of marketing campaigns, tracking the impact of marketing campaigns, making adjustments as needed, keeping tabs on your competition, and tracking Net Promoter Score, right? Those are really the 6 key reasons why brand trackers matter, right? And why you should be using them. So what should you be tracking, right? Well, at the very basic level, the thing that you're going to be tracking first is called brand awareness, right? And people talk about these terms differently. Some people say unaided versus aided. Some people say top of mind. Whatever. I mean, generally the way I think about it, when you think of awareness or brand recall, you have 2 ways of looking at that. One is unaided brand awareness, right? So the idea here is you create a list of, you create a question and you say, which of the following brands have you heard of for toothpaste? And you put, 6 different, you leave kind of like 6 different blanks and you ask people basically to fill in the brands that they've heard of, right? That would be called unaided brand awareness, right? That's really the most powerful brand awareness that you can have, right? If people ask you, about 6 different brands or 5 different brands or 3 different brands, and they mention your brand, and there's no prompt, then that's a more powerful indicator. That means that you're kind of like more present in the consumer's mind, right? And the second is, of course, called aided brand awareness. So there you would ask the same question. You would say, hey, of the following brands of toothpaste, which have you heard of? And you would list, Colgate and, whatever else. And then people would say, yeah, I've heard of Colgate. I've heard of this. I've heard of that, right? So that's aided brand awareness. Within brand awareness, one of the things that's important to mention is kind of like what we call top of mind, right? So what are the first brands that people remember in your category when they mention the brands that they are aware of, right? The more spontaneous the recall of your brand and the more you tend to be the first brand that people think of, the better, right? So top of mind is important, and that's more of a secondary metric for people who are already in more established markets, very highly competitive markets. Top of mind is going to be an important one. Second, kind of within the brand awareness category of things that you should be tracking is what we call recognition, right? And so brand recognition is really kind of like, if they've seen a campaign of yours, if they've seen advertising, a billboard, a mobile ad banner, a YouTube video, etc., would they recognize you, right? Where did they see you, right? So the idea of being able to recognize your brand and, being able to attribute where they saw your brand, what type of communications medium you were using, that's pretty important as well, right? So brand awareness kind of is the first kind of big bucket, if you will, that we should be tracking. The second big bucket that we should be tracking is kind of what we call brand experience and usage, right? So that has 2 components, obviously the experience kind of component and the usage component. When we talk about usage, for example, we're really asking questions like, for example, in the past 4 weeks, have you used, Colgate toothpaste, right? You're really looking at how recent was the time that they use your product, and are you part of the products that they have been using? One of the other questions you would also ask as well is, what is your intent in the next 2 weeks to actually use this service or use this product, right? If you're going to do a search in the next couple of weeks, are you going to use Google? Are you going to Bing? Are you going to use Yahoo? What's your intent to use that product, right? And then, of course, in customer behavior, one of the things that you might also want to be looking for is the likelihood that they might change their behavior, right? So which of the following products might you be considering using? Or if you were going to buy toothpaste in the next couple of weeks, are you going to still buy our brand, or would you potentially be trying these other brands, right? So likelihood of change is an important thing that you want to be serving as well. And kind of like last but not least in terms of customer behavior is what we talked about earlier when we talked about one of the things that really matters is customer satisfaction and loyalty, right? What we commonly call Net Promoter Score or NPS, right? So the question typically is, would you be willing to recommend this product to a friend? Or how likely would you be to recommend this product to a friend? And some people do a yes/no answer. I prefer to do kind of a sliding scale where you say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, would you be willing to recommend? And the general rule of thumb is that if you get a 7 to 10, that's a very strong NPS score. That's what we would call kind of like a loyalist, right? Somebody who is willing to recommend. If it's something like 5 or 6, then they're kind of under the fence. They're kind of on the fence. And typically, if it's lower than 5, then what you have is what we call a brand detractor, right? Which is, in that case, it's a person that's probably much less likely to say good things about you. So NPS and customer is one of the key kind of questions in customer behavior. The second part of the brand experience and usage bucket, obviously, is customer satisfaction, right? So there you're asking questions, for example, like, how satisfied were they with the purchase experience? How satisfied were they with the shopping experience, right? This is particularly important if you're a retail brand, right? If you're Amazon or Costco, et cetera. Were they satisfied with customer service, right? So, sometimes people have an issue with the product. They have to call customer service. How was that experience, right? So those are the type of questions that you want to be asking around customer satisfaction. You want to be finding out, how the overall experience of using the product has been. You also want to ask about how has the experience been compared to the expectation that the customer has, right? So delivering on the customer experience, what has the consumer's experience been there versus what they saw in your advertisement or in your white paper or in your email campaign or on TV, right? So that's kind of what you're looking at when you're talking about user experience and usage. You're talking about customer satisfaction on the one hand, customer behavior on the other hand. The third kind of big bucket and the last big bucket that you're tracking when you're talking about brand trackers is what we call brand image, right? And that's really kind of the perception of how the consumer sees your brand, right? And so within brand image, really, there are 6 different categories there that you're going to want to be testing. And I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail because otherwise this video is going to get really long and you guys are all going to fall asleep on me and you're not going to like the video or share it or whatever. I'll have a post that goes into more detail about this. But you have essentially 6 different things. You have the benefits of the brand, right? So how they perceive the benefit. The strengths of the brand. So what do they think really are your core strengths as a brand? Favorability of the brand, brand attributes, non-attributes, and then uniqueness, right? And so some of these are intuitive, right? Some of them are less intuitive. When you're talking about brand attributes and things like that, you're typically talking about things like product features, right? Or the performance of the product. When you're talking about non-product attributes, there you might be talking about things like, imagery, or how does the consumer feel when they use your product, right? That's a great question is, after you've used this product, how do you feel after having used this? What does this product make you feel like? And feeling is really important, right? Because as I talked about in some of my other posts and videos, if you look at my blog, madmork.com/blog, I talk a lot about stories, right? I talk a lot about how consumers feel. And that's a direct, function of, expectation that they have of your product and brand on the one hand versus what the experience really delivers, right? So that feeling is really important because it's a reflection of your ability to deliver on your brand promise, your story, and how the consumer feels after having used your product, right? Uniqueness is obviously differentiation. How unique do they really feel your product is, right? The less unique your product is, the higher the probability that the consumer might actually churn and decide to use something else. So, these are all things to keep in mind of when you're testing brand awareness and you're looking at brand image and things like that. Moving on, in terms of other things that go into brand trackers, we've talked a little bit about what you should be tracking, right? So brand awareness, brand experience and usage, brand image. How often should you be doing this? Well, that's kind of a trick question because the cop-out answer is it really depends. It depends on a couple of things. First of all, it depends on, how competitive is your industry, right? So if your industry is not really competitive, or if you have, monopoly power over your industry, good for you, by the way. Don't ever say that to U.S. regulators. Then you probably don't have to do brand tracking as often because, your brand awareness and your core metrics are not going to change a lot. If you are, working in the mobile gaming industry where it's like, 400 some games are being submitted to the App Store each week, then you have a lot more competition, right? And there's a lot more advertising. And so there you're going to want to be testing and doing brand tracking much more often. Some people say that you should do this yearly as part of kind of like a brand audit, brand exercise, and part of your planning exercise. Again, I think it depends on how much competition you have. I think it depends on other things like the frequency of your product releases, right? So if you look at consumer goods, Pepsi and Coke don't change their product a whole lot, right? Sorry to say that. As a former Pepsi employee, the product doesn't freaking change a lot, right? Maybe they change the can or they change the advertising. And still, when I was at Pepsi, we were tracking brand awareness like every quarter. In other industries, particularly in software and services, you might be changing the product a lot, right? If you're a startup or you're an early stage company, you're going to be iterating and making a lot of releases very quickly. And so there you're going to see that, the brand tracking results are going to change. Why? Because the product is changing. And so the consumer expectation is changing. So I think you really have to be a judge of that and look at how competitive your industry is and look at how frequently you're making changes to your product. And finally, how frequently are you making major changes to your advertising, right? Either in terms of, dialing up or down the level of spend, or changing your actual advertising creative and your messaging and positioning. So I would say kind of my recommendation as a rule of thumb is I like to do things at least quarterly because I think it gives you a good pulse and a good read. If you're doing things more often, I've seen some companies do it as often as monthly, right? Because they're making a lot of changes with a high frequency. They have a software product, so they're making changes on the fly, and they're changing their advertising and fine-tuning things. So anywhere from monthly to quarterly, I would say at a minimum, you probably want to do this twice a year, in my opinion. How many questions do you have? Well, again, it varies. It depends on what all the metrics are that you want to track. But I would say kind of a maximum is around 25 questions. Remember that consumers have survey fatigue at times, right? And they are impatient. So people don't want to be answering questions for like half an hour, right? So people have a limit in terms of the patience that they have. So, as few questions as possible and as focused as possible, really think of what are the core metrics that you want to be tracking? What are the core metrics that you expect to be changing? I would keep it as a function of those things and, keep it to a pretty set defined of questions. It's really important as well not to change your questions too often, right? Because if you do that, it's really hard to track the evolution over time, right? You can change and add questions on the fly once in a while. So I've seen companies that, for example, if you use online platforms like SurveyMonkey or Survata or others, you can insert one or two questions if you have a very specific question that you want to ask. But in general, I would try and keep the questions the same and not change them too often because it completely screws up your consistency. Things to be aware of, just kind of in closing here. First of all, these things are not perfect, right? They are there to help you measure and track brand the way you would track any other metrics like sales or leads. But, it's a certain kind of customer answers these things, right? And some people say sometimes that customers are at risk of having survey fatigue. They're sick of answering questions, or a particular kind of person likes to answer surveys and other people don't like to answer surveys ever. I'm one of these people. I hardly ever answer surveys, right? So you're never going to have a perfect sample size, but it's important also that your sample size be wide enough, right? So statistically speaking, your provider should be able to tell you, okay, well, if your customer base is 5 million users, the N sample size number should be at a minimum this much, right? With a 95% chance of 95% confidence interval, right? And plus or minus 5%. So you want to make sure that, you have a healthy enough sample size so that it is kind of realistic and that it's going to reflect what potentially the overall market thinks, right? In closing, a couple of people who do this, I mentioned Survata. I've used them before. They're a small startup here in the Bay Area. I used them when they were Course Hero. They're pretty good. I'm now looking at using them to support another client that I'm working with. Then there's bigger companies like, Cantor Millward Brown, is part of WPP, which is obviously a huge publicly listed advertising company. So, Cantor works with a lot of big brands and does, brand tracking surveys as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. There's other companies like AMR, Nielsen, obviously really, really well-known research agency that does a whole ton of stuff, including brand trackers. They're pretty good at that. I think another one is YouGov. I think I use those guys at Google to do the brand tracking survey for Google Play. They were pretty good, pretty reliable. And of course, SurveyMonkey, right? You can use SurveyMonkey for pretty much anything. So anyway, guys, I hope that's helpful. That's it. We covered a lot of stuff. I think we're going on like 20 minutes or something. So I'm gonna shut up and chill out now. And hopefully you guys found this useful. Again, if this was helpful to you, like the video, share it, make sure you subscribe to my channel because, I'm always posting cool stuff and I promise not to put you to sleep on stuff. So there's other videos that we're going to be putting live as well on career development. We're going to be talking about product marketing in the next couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about PR. Make sure you check out my blog at madmork.com/blog. There's always a lot of interesting things there. We have a Facebook page as well, facebook.com/madmorkstories. And Twitter, you can follow me on Mad Mork as well. So awesome. Hope that was helpful. Peace out. Hope you enjoyed the video. And I will catch you guys on Vcast number 5 next time. See you later, guys.